In February 1916, the Gila River rose higher than anyone in Graham County, Arizona could remember, and when the water finally pulled back from Chalk Mesa, it had taken nearly 4 feet of caliche and sediment with it. A rancher named Walter Kinney rode out 3 days after the flood to check on cattle he assumed were dead, and instead of carcasses in the new arroyo cut along the mesa's east face, he found stone. Not scattered stone, not the tumbled boulders that fall naturally off a sandstone rim, a wall. It ran for roughly 90 feet along the base of the freshly scoured cut, and where the water had washed cleanest, the blocks sat in level courses, fitted edge to edge with no visible mortar and no gap wide enough to slide a knife blade into. Kinney had worked that land for 11 years. He had ridden past that mesa face more times than he could count, and nothing about it had ever looked like anything but rock. Now the flood had stripped the mesa's skin away and left the bone showing, and the bone was cut stone sitting where cut stone had no business being, under soil that had taken, by any reasonable estimate, centuries to build up. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Chalk Mesa sits on the north bank of the Gila, a low table of buff sandstone rising maybe 60 feet above the floodplain, unremarkable on every survey map drawn of that stretch of Graham County since the 1880s. The General Land Office had passed through in 1891 and noted it only as an elevation, useful for triangulation, of no particular interest otherwise. The Sobaipuri and later the Western Apache had both moved through this stretch of the Gila for generations before any surveyor arrived, and neither people had ever claimed the mesa itself as a settlement site in the accounts collected by early ethnographers. That absence mattered to what came later, because it meant nobody expected worked stone under Chalk Mesa. The federal record treated the whole area as marginal grazing land, dry, uneventful, not worth a second look. Kinney's own homestead patent, filed in 1905, describes the mesa in a single line as rangeland unsuited to cultivation. Nobody who wrote that line had any reason to imagine that 4 feet down, under soil old enough to have buried a wall to its lintels, sat a structure built with a precision the surrounding country had no other known example of. The Gila had flooded before. A bad flood in 1905 reshaped the river channel for miles, and residents still talked about it a decade later. But the 1905 flood had not touched Chalk Mesa's east face the way the 1916 flood did. The later event was different in kind, not just in size. Weeks of rain across the watershed had saturated ground that normally sheds water fast, and when the river came up, it did not simply spread across the floodplain, it cut. Arroyos that had existed as shallow washes for as long as anyone could remember became channels 10 and 12 feet deep in places, and it was in one of those new channels, at the base of Chalk Mesa, that Kinney found his wall. He rode back to his house, got a shovel and a hand level, and returned within the hour. What he found when he started clearing debris away from the exposed face was not a single wall, but a corner. 2 runs of stone meeting at what his level told him was a true right angle, and behind the corner, packed with silt but unmistakably hollow, the beginning of an interior space. Kinney did not touch anything further that day. He rode to Safford the next morning and sent a telegram to the Territorial Land Office describing what he had found, and within a week that telegram had been forwarded, as such things sometimes were in that period, to the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington. The Bureau had an active interest in Southwestern archaeology at the time. Jesse Walter Fuchs, who ran much of the Bureau's Southwestern survey work through the 1910s, had spent years cataloguing Hopi and Zuni sites to the north, and kept a standing arrangement with several field correspondents across Arizona who reported unusual finds as they turned up. Kinney's telegram reached the Bureau's Washington office in March of 1916. A reply came back in May, 6 weeks later, signed by an assistant in Fuchs's office rather than Fuchs himself, thanking Kinney for his report and noting that flood exposure of masonry ruins was not unusual in that region and that the Bureau's field schedule for the year was already committed. No one came. Kinney kept a copy of both his telegram and the reply for the rest of his life, and his granddaughter still has them. The Bureau's decision not to act cannot be explained by a simple lack of resources that season. Fuchs's own field reports for 1916 list 3 separate expeditions funded that year, one to the Hopi Mesas in northern Arizona, one to Casa Grande south of Phoenix, and a smaller reconnaissance in New Mexico, all sites that fit comfortably within the construction map the Bureau had already drawn and could publish on without complication. A telegram describing fitted, mortarless masonry on the Gila, outside that map entirely, competed for attention against sites the Bureau already understood. Kinney's wall asked a harder question than any of the 3 funded expeditions did that year, and it went unanswered less for lack of money than for lack of a category it fit inside. What makes the dismissal harder to accept in hindsight is what Kinney's letter actually described, because he was specific in a way that a rancher inventing a story usually is not. He gave measurements. The exposed wall ran, by his estimate, 91 feet along the arroyo cut before disappearing back under undisturbed soil at both ends. The corner he had cleared showed blocks averaging 2 feet by 1 foot by 10 inches, sandstone, cut square on all visible faces, laid without any binding material he could find. He noted that the mortar joints common in the ruins he had seen elsewhere in the territory, the crumbling adobe-bonded Pueblo walls scattered across that part of Arizona, were entirely absent here. The stones simply sat against each other, fitted so closely that Kinney wrote he could not work his pocket-knife blade into most of the seams. He also noted something the Bureau's reply did not address at all. The wall did not sit on bare bedrock. It sat on a prepared bed of smaller, flatter stones laid in a single course beneath the wall's footing, a leveling course, the kind of engineering choice a builder makes when the ground beneath cannot be trusted to hold a structure's weight evenly. Adobe Pueblo construction across the Southwest in this period generally did not include prepared footing courses of this kind. Fitted, mortarless masonry, with a leveling course beneath it, was a technique documented at only a handful of sites in the region, and none of them this far down the Gila. Kinney did not wait for the Bureau's reply before testing what he had found on his own. In the fall of 1917, more than a year after his first telegram, he pried loose a fist-sized fragment from the exposed corner and sent it, with a note describing where it came from, to an assayer's office in Tucson that tested rock and mineral samples for local mining claims. The assayer's return letter, dated November of that year and kept along with the rest of Kinney's correspondence, describes the sample as a fine-grained arcosic sandstone, quarried rather than gathered, based on what the letter calls unusually uniform grain orientation across the cut face, a characteristic the assayer noted was more typical of stone worked with a consistent tool angle than of naturally weathered fragments. The letter makes no grand claims. It simply notes that whoever shaped the block had dressed all 6 faces to within what the assayer estimated, by eye and caliper, as a 1/4 inch of true flatness, a tolerance he called higher than necessary for a plain structural wall and more consistent with finished stonework. There is no indication the assayer knew anything about the wall's likely age, and no suggestion in his letter that he found anything unusual in it beyond the workmanship itself. He simply reported what the stone showed him. 2 years passed before anyone with formal training examined the site in person. Arthur Voss was a hydraulic engineer with the United States Reclamation Service, sent to Graham County in 1918 to assess flood damage along the Gila as part of a broader survey of irrigation infrastructure across the territory. Voss's job had nothing to do with archaeology. He was there to measure channel erosion, evaluate diversion dam damage, and recommend bank stabilization work. But Voss had grown up outside Flagstaff and had spent enough time around Bureau excavations as a young man to recognize worked stone when he saw it, and Kinney, still frustrated 2 years on, made a point of taking him out to the arroyo. Voss's official Reclamation Service report, filed in October of 1918, is almost entirely about channel geometry and bank stabilization, but on its final page, in a section labeled Miscellaneous Observations, he included 4 paragraphs about the Chalk Mesa wall, and those 4 paragraphs remain the closest thing to an independent technical assessment the site has ever received. Voss measured the wall's remaining exposed length at 87 feet, slightly less than Kinney's estimate 2 years earlier, which he attributed to soil having washed back over the ends since 1916. He confirmed the mortarless fitted construction and the leveling course beneath it. Using a plumb line to check the wall's face for batter, the deliberate inward lean many ancient masonry walls carry for stability, he found none. The wall rose perfectly vertical for its entire exposed height of just under 6 feet. He also recorded something Kinney's letter had not mentioned, because 2 additional years of erosion had exposed it. At the base of the interior corner, beneath the silt fill, Voss found the top of what he described as a second wall running perpendicular to the first at a depth several feet below the floor level, implied by the first structure, suggesting either an earlier construction phase beneath the visible one or a considerably deeper structure than the exposed corner alone would indicate. Voss recommended in writing that the Bureau of American Ethnology or the Smithsonian Institution be contacted for a proper excavation before further erosion destroyed the site. His report went through normal reclamation service channels and was, in the ordinary course of business, forwarded to the relevant outside agencies as a courtesy. The Bureau's own correspondence file shows a one-line acknowledgement of Voss's report dated January 1919. Nothing else in the Bureau's file for that site postdates it. The nearest documented examples of comparably dressed and fitted masonry sit well outside the Gila drainage. Kinishba, roughly 90 miles northeast near Fort Apache, and Casa Malpais, farther east near present-day Springerville, are both associated with construction phases the accepted chronology places in the 13th and 14th centuries, and both were built by ancestral Mogollon and Puebloan populations working within a masonry tradition well documented by the 1920s. Both sites also sit at elevations above 5,000 feet in pine and juniper country, far from the low desert floodplain where Chalk Mesa sits under 3,000 feet. Fuchs and his contemporaries at the Bureau had spent 2 decades mapping where that dressed stone tradition ran and where it stopped, and by their own published surveys it stopped well north and east of the Gila's middle course. A wall built to Kinishba's standard of precision, sitting on the Gila floodplain 90 miles outside the boundary the Bureau's own maps had drawn, did not fit the construction sequence its discoverers had spent careers establishing. It either meant the boundary was wrong, or it meant something else was responsible, and neither possibility is one the Bureau's brief acknowledgement letter shows any interest in pursuing. Later regional syntheses of Southwestern masonry traditions, published well after Fuchs's death in 1930, still draw the boundary of the dressed stone tradition largely along the lines his surveys established, with Chalk Mesa appearing in none of them, cited in none of their site lists, because it was never entered into the record those syntheses drew from in the first place. What happened to Voss afterward has never been documented in any Reclamation Service personnel file that has surfaced, but what is documented is stranger than a simple non-response would have been. In the spring of 1919, 3 months after his report was acknowledged and filed, the Reclamation Service reassigned Voss out of Arizona entirely to a survey posting in Wyoming, a transfer his surviving correspondence with a cousin in Tucson describes as unexpected and, in his own words, not something I asked for or wanted. Voss never returned to Arizona in a professional capacity. He continued his engineering career in the Rocky Mountain states until his retirement in the 1940s, and in none of his later reports, several of which survive in Reclamation Service archives, did he ever again mention Chalk Mesa or the wall he had measured there. His cousin's letters, held today by a regional historical society in Tucson, include one from 1922 in which Voss is quoted saying he had learned there were things a federal engineer was better off not writing reports about, though the letter does not specify what prompted the remark. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The wall drew one more documented visitor before the 20th century was half over. In the summer of 1954, a geology instructor from the University of Arizona named Louis Hartwell was in Graham County mapping river terrace deposits along the Gila for an unrelated study of the region's flood history, the same kind of work that had first brought Voss out to Kinney's land 36 years earlier. A neighboring rancher who knew the Kinney family mentioned the wall to Hartwell over a fence one afternoon, and Hartwell, curious, asked to see it. What he found, still standing behind the same fence Kinney's son had rebuilt twice by then, matched Voss's 1918 description closely enough that Hartwell wrote to the university's anthropology department suggesting a joint survey. His letter, preserved in the department's own correspondence file, describes the masonry as, in his words, better finished than anything I have seen this far south of the Mogollon Rim, and recommends test excavation before further erosion removes what remains. The department's reply 6 weeks later declined, citing a lack of available field budget for the coming season and noting that the site had already been assessed, by which the writer meant Voss's 36-year-old paragraph filed away and treated as sufficient. Hartwell did not pursue it further. He continued his terrace mapping, published 2 papers on Gila River flood chronology later in the decade that make no mention of Chalk Mesa, and left the university in 1961 for a position with a private consulting firm in Phoenix. In a short memoir he wrote for his family late in life, held today by his son, Hartwell included one paragraph about the wall, ending it with a line his son has since quoted to the handful of people who have asked, "I always meant to go back and never did, and I have wondered since what that says about how these things get lost. A third file exists that neither the Bureau nor the university ever saw." In 1976, a range conservationist with the Federal Bureau of Land Management named Diane Osgood was surveying grazing allotments along the Gila as part of a routine land health assessment when the Kinney family, by then several decades into a working relationship with federal grazing administrators, mentioned the wall almost in passing during a site visit. Osgood was not an archaeologist, but her training required her to note any cultural resource encountered during a survey, and she filed a short cultural resource observation form describing a fitted stone wall of apparent antiquity exposed along an arroyo cut, recommending referral to the agency's cultural resource staff for evaluation. That form exists today in the Bureau of Land Management's regional case file, stamped received in October of 1976. With a handwritten note in a different hand, in the margin reading, "No further action required. Parcel is private land, outside BLM jurisdiction." The note is accurate as far as it goes. The wall sits on private ground, and the agency had no legal standing to excavate or even formally record a site on land it did not administer. But the form was never forwarded to the Arizona State Museum, whose statewide site file exists to track discoveries like this one regardless of land ownership, and no cross-reference between Osgood's 1976 observation and Voss's 1918 report or Hartwell's 1954 letter appears anywhere in either agency's records. 3 separate professionals, working for 3 separate institutions across 60 years, each independently confirmed the same wall, and none of their reports ever reached the same desk. What connects Kinney's dismissal in 1916, Voss's reassignment in 1919, and Hartwell's declined proposal in 1954 is not one decision made by one office, but it is closer to a pattern repeating itself across 6 decades and 3 separate institutions, each operating on its own budget and its own assumptions about where dressed stone masonry belonged on the map of Arizona prehistory. Each office, presented with the same physical evidence at a different point in time, reached the same conclusion by the same method, treating a prior non-investigation as sufficient grounds for the next one. No one falsified a record. No one on paper denies the wall exists. The file simply closes itself, decade after decade, on the strength of the last person who also declined to look closely. There is a further thread here that never reached any of the 3 institutions because it was never submitted to any of them. In the 1950s, an anthropologist working under a small private grant interviewed several Western Apache elders in the San Carlos area about oral traditions concerning the Gila River corridor, part of a broader place name project that was never formally published and survives today only as typed field notes held by a university library in Tucson. One elder, identified in the notes only by initials, described a place along the river where, in his account, a people who came before both the Apache and the O'odham had built with stone cut square, a detail the interviewer's own notes flag as unusual, since most Apache oral tradition along that stretch of the Gila describes earlier inhabitants in terms of earthen or brush structures rather than dressed stone. The elder did not name Chalk Mesa specifically, and the interviewer, working decades after Kinney's original find and apparently unaware of it, made no connection between the two. The grant that funded the project ran out the following year, the notes were boxed and shelved rather than written up for publication, and the interviewer moved to a teaching post out of state not long afterward. The field notes were never cross-referenced with the Bureau's file on the wall, because the two records sat in separate institutions with no occasion to compare notes on an obscure homestead correspondence from 1916. It is only with both documents available side by side, as they are now, that the overlap becomes visible at all. What a formal excavation might have settled, and never has, is which came first, the wall Kinney found, or the deeper course Voss glimpsed beneath it. Fitted masonry with a leveling course is not, by itself, proof of enormous age. It is proof of a builder solving a specific engineering problem, unstable ground, with a specific and costly solution. Whether that builder worked 800 years ago, within the window the Bureau's own maps allow for dressed stone this far south, or considerably earlier, is a question no carbon sample, no ceramic cross-date, no stratigraphic section has ever been taken to answer, because no excavation has ever opened the ground here. The Apache elders' account of a people who built with stone-cut square, who came before both the Apache and the Oadam arrived along this stretch of the Gila, offers no date at all, only a sequence, and sequences recorded in oral tradition have on other southwestern sites been shown to preserve real information about occupation order that the physical record later confirmed. Whether that holds true at Chalk Mesa is unverifiable without the excavation nobody has funded. What the evidence permits, without overstating it, is a wall that does not match the surrounding construction tradition, sitting on a floodplain outside the recognized boundary for that tradition, resting on an engineering solution suited to a problem the builder clearly understood and the institutions asked to investigate it never did. Modern tools that could resolve at least part of the question have never been brought to Chalk Mesa either. Ground-penetrating radar, capable of mapping buried masonry to a depth of several meters without disturbing a shovelful of soil, has become routine on southwestern archaeological surveys since the 1990s, used at sites across the Mogollon Rim and the Salt River Valley to trace wall alignments before excavation ever begins. No such survey has ever been proposed for Chalk Mesa, in part because the site has no formal accession number in any state database to justify a research budget against, and in part because the family's own caution about publicizing the location has kept it out of the casual awareness of the university departments that own the equipment. Kinney's granddaughter says she would allow a properly credentialed survey team onto the land if one ever asked, and that in more than 40 years of managing the allotment, no university, no state agency, and no federal office has ever formally requested access for that purpose. The closest anyone came was an informal conversation in the 2010s with a graduate student compiling a thesis on Gila River archaeology, who expressed interest after reading a brief mention of Voss's report in the Reclamation Service archive, then never followed up once the semester ended. The interior space Kinney first noticed behind the exposed corner in 1916, the hollow he described as unmistakable even through the silt fill, has never been probed, radar mapped, or excavated by anyone in the 110 years since he first swung a shovel at it. What sits inside it, and how it connects to the second wall Voss glimpsed at greater depth, remains exactly as unknown today as it was the week the flood receded. The corner still stands today largely as Hartwell photographed it in 1954, though the photograph itself was never published and exists only as a single print kept in his family's papers. Weathering has softened the sharp edge where the wall's two faces meet, and lichen has taken hold in patches across the stone's north-facing side, but the courses remain level, the joints remain tight enough that a knife blade still will not seat in most of them, and the leveling course beneath the footing, where erosion has exposed a short stretch of it, still shows the same careful selection of flat stones Voss described more than a century ago. Kinney's granddaughter, who asked that her name not appear in any public account of the site out of concern for uninvited visitors on private grazing land, still runs cattle on the same allotment her grandfather homesteaded in 1905. She walks out to check the fence line perhaps twice a year, mostly after heavy rain, mostly out of habit inherited from a grandfather who never stopped believing someone would eventually come to dig. Over the years, she has turned away a handful of amateur treasure hunters who heard some second-hand version of the story and came looking for the wall without permission, and for that reason, the family has stayed guarded about its exact location beyond the general description of the mesa's east face above the Gila. In August of 1983, heavy monsoon rain across the upper Gila watershed pushed the river close to the levels recorded in 1916, and the arroyo below Chalk Mesa ran high enough that Kinney's granddaughter, then a young woman helping her father move cattle off the bottomland, remembers watching the water climb to within a few feet of the fence line before it crested and began to fall. It did not cut further into the bank that year. The Arizona State Museum's site files, checked as recently as the 2000s, contain no separate accession for Chalk Mesa, distinct from a brief, second-hand entry in the county's own 1970s historical inventory, which lists the location only as an unverified masonry feature on private land, citing Voss's report as its sole source and noting that no site visit was conducted. In institutional terms, the wall Walter Kinney found while looking for dead cattle does not officially exist as an investigated archaeological site. It exists as a rancher's telegram, an assayer's letter, a federal engineer's 4 paragraphs on the last page of an irrigation report, a geology instructor's declined proposal, a range conservationist's form marked no further action required, and a corner of stone still standing behind a fence that has outlasted every institution ever told about it. The second wall, Voss noted beneath the first, has never been reached. Whatever depth it runs to, whatever it connects to, remains underground that has had 13 decades to settle since the last time the river opened it enough to show what was underneath. The Gila will flood again. It always has. Whether the next flood that reaches Chalk Mesa finishes what 1916 started, or simply buries Walter Kinney's corner a little deeper than it already sits, is not something any agency has planned for, because on every map the Bureau of American Ethnology, the state of Arizona, and the Arizona State Museum have ever kept, Chalk Mesa remains exactly what it was in 1891, an elevation noted for triangulation, of no particular interest otherwise. A rancher looking for dead cattle found what a century of federal surveys had walked past without seeing, wrote it down carefully enough that a stranger reading his letters today can still reconstruct the wall's dimensions to the inch, and sent that account to the one office in the country whose entire purpose was to care. The reply took 6 weeks and said, in substance, not now. No one has come since to say otherwise. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.